This video is brought to you by Against the Flow of Mississippi. Against the Flow of Mississippi is a book about Jake Fayard, a Marine veteran who is unhappy with the political machine running the state of Mississippi. He decides to fight the corruption from the inside. Jake will face more challenges than he ever has and will stand up for what he thinks is right. His notoriously hot temper will push him to the edge of murder, along with his friend and brother Kobe Barhanovich. Together, they will fight the system and give the power back to the citizens of Mississippi. Against the Flow of Mississippi is now available on Amazon. A link to the book will be placed in the description below. Welcome to History in the Eyes of a Southerner with your host, Anthony Allen. On this channel, we will take a journey through time and relate history to the contemporary eyes of modern America. I hope you enjoy the ride as I investigate and document the wonderful events that have shaped our present world. All right, y'all. It's time for another episode of History with Anthony O. And I want to talk about, I may actually turn this into a series. I haven't decided yet, but I want to talk about controversial figures of the South. And Lord knows we have our share down here in the South. I'm down here in South Mississippi again. I'm back home. But I follow a page on Facebook. Page that a guy named Mike Elam created called Buford Pusser, The Other Story. Now, I'm a fan of the Walking Tall movies. The original. The one with The Rock was The ones with Kevin Sorbo were just cringe. It's about the best way I put them. That's probably why they went direct to DVD and nobody ever even knows that they even came out. But the original movies, the first one in 1973 with Joe Don Baker, the subsequent two in 1975 and 1977 with Bo Svensson, you know, the two that Buford Pusser himself was supposed to play himself. I like them. I think they're good movies. But the question is does Hollywood actually get it right? The answer is seldom. We all know this. We all know that Hollywood is made up of a bunch of people who take a little bit of truth and put a whole lot of creative licensing with it. There's quite a few movies out there that are based on a true story. And we know they're based on a true story because they tell us, hey, it's based on a true story. Movies like The Blind Side was based on a true story. Michael Orr himself has said that there was a lot of inaccuracies in that movie. Think of some other good ones. Let's see here. The Departed
based on a true story. But there was inaccuracies. Casino was based on a true story. Goodfellas, based on a true story. But there was a lot of inaccuracies. So we've come to expect this from Hollywood, that there will be a lot of inaccuracies in based on a true story. But what happens when somebody goes from real life living person to having a movie made after him, to becoming a living legend, and then a dead legend? What happens? Well, the thing with a legend is a legend always grows. Tall tales get taller. I went fishing the other day and I caught a fish that was that big. No, wait, it was that big. Oh, no, it was that big. It works. That's how things work. A lot of Hollywood movies, as we all know, are false. Again, that's where the creative licensing comes in. But let's go back to Buford Pusser. Who was Buford Pusser? Was he the giant that wielded a pine tree around with him everywhere he went? And every time he saw a bad guy, he swung that big stick of his and took his head off and, Or was he somebody who did more harm than good? That's what I want to investigate here. Now, I've seen the movie, and I've done my own research, and I've read the research of others. A lot of my sources are going to come from a couple of people. I have friends in McNairy County, Tennessee, or had a friend. I haven't talked to him in a few years, and I think, sadly, that he's no longer with us. But he was certainly around during the Buford Pusser era. And he grew up over in Eastview, Tennessee. Or not Eastview, Eastwick, or whatever it is. Raymer, that area. Off of Highway 57 up there. And he runs around with a few of the guys that are currently operating on the state line. I know the state line gang was rumored to have been ran by the Dixie Mafia. I want to delve into what the Dixie Mafia is too. And I know quite a bit about the Dixie Mafia. From my own personal family experiences. We're going to get into that later. Buford Pusser was the sheriff in the 60s in McNairy County, Tennessee. I think he became sheriff in 1965, late 1964, early 1965. However, they do elections up there. And I think by 70, he was out. Now, we all know what was going on in the South during the 60s. It was pretty turbulent times in the South. This was the civil rights era. Most Southern sheriffs were not sympathetic to any civil rights activities whatsoever. their attitudes were actually portrayed in the first Walking Tall movie. When Sheriff Tanner, played by the same guy who was actually one of Elvis's bodyguards, by the way, in real life, called a whole bunch of black kids that were killed by drinking poison moonshine a civil rights picnic. During the movie, Joe Don Baker, playing the part of Sheriff Buford Pusser, when he goes to recruit his friend to become the first black deputy of McNairy County, tells him, I have 8 dead laid out in Alcorn County, Mississippi. Insert your racial slur in the blank space there, 6-letter word, starts with an N, ends with an R. So the racial tensions, though he was portrayed in the movie as what's the term I'm looking for? A pioneer in hiring the first black deputy sheriff of the county, was still very apparent. And these are movies that were made, the first movie was made a decade after the events would have taken place. First movie came out in 1973. So these racial tensions in the South were still very apparent. Joe Don Baker, himself a Southerner, understood this and knew. Bo Svensson. Bo didn't really show any racism in his betrayal of Buford Pusser, but he had only lived in the South as an adult. He was born in Europe. I want to say he was born in Switzerland, I believe. Maybe Belgium, I don't know, somewhere out that way. He wasn't born in the South, so he may have actually felt a little uncomfortable portraying the race relations. More on that later. I'm not going to say every sheriff in the South in the 1960s was corrupt, but I will say most of them were. I know here where I'm living at now, where I'm from in Harrison County, Mississippi, the sheriff at the time was very corrupt. Eddie McDonald was, Jesus Christ, if that man was still alive today, I wish he could have lived to been 1,000, because Lord knows he would have been doing time for the rest of his life, along with my grandfather who served under him, by the way. But like Hollywood tries to make a David versus Goliath in a lot of the based on a true stories that they do, it's usually not that simple. Now, I come from a law enforcement background myself. I'm a former correctional officer. I've dealt with the worst of the worst. But I have a moral compass that dictates to me that law enforcement officers do not enforce the law by breaking it. Well, if you look at the Walking Tall movies, how many felonies does Buford Pusser commit? When you walk up to somebody with a stick and you pop somebody up top of the head with a stick that you're carrying, first off, walking up to a fight with a stick like that is premeditated. which he didn't carry a stick, but we're going to assume for the moment that he did. If I know I'm fixing a fight and I come up to somebody with a stick and my first move is to go upside somebody's head, we call that a felony. We call that aggravated assault here in Mississippi. And that's exactly what that is. No different than if I take this knife and I stab somebody. That's aggravated assault. If I take my gun and I shoot somebody, that's aggravated assault. If I take this coffee cup and go upside somebody's head, that's aggravated assault. I'm using a weapon. Using my fist would be simple assault. Now, granted, he's the sheriff who's going to arrest him, and unfortunately, that was basically the way it was back then. My grandpa was a deputy sheriff, again, here in Harrison County, Mississippi, from 1950 to 1985. And he would tell people, "What are you going to do, arrest me? I got the key in my pocket." And he was right. Well, now we're dealing with a sheriff, a high sheriff, not a deputy, but the high sheriff. Who's going to arrest him? Back then. Considering that a sheriff is a constitutional office. It's in the Constitution that every county or parish will have a sheriff. So now we have a duly elected sheriff on the screen, on the big screen, just going in and tearing the hell out of anybody who crossed him. Didn't matter who they were. And he's hailed as a hero. Oh, I'm going to bust the state liners. I'm going to bust the state liners. Well, let's look at this. The state line, if they were ran by the Dixie Mafia, which really wasn't even coined until the late 60s, by the way, and it was coined by a man by the name of Rex Armistead, who was a Mississippi Highway Patrol investigator, which what we would now know would be the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation. But back then, he was just a Highway Patrol investigator. Coined the term by a band of loose-knit criminals here on the coast, based out of Biloxi, my hometown. Did they have anything to do with the State Line Gang? Maybe. I'm sure they knew each other because the illegal gambling was going on down here on the coast years before it was ever legal. On the state line of Tennessee, I know as late as 2006, there was illegal gambling going on up there. I know that for a fact. The reason I know that, I was there. Me and my friend, I'm not going to mention his name, went to a hunting club and got into an illegal craps game. I like craps. Now, it was a friendly game, but it was still going on. It wasn't as widespread as what was going on in the movie, as the movie portrayed, where you got the hookers running back and forth to the trailers, and you know, you walk in and you got the bar, and then you go into the back room and you got all these people back there throwing craps and playing slot machines. I'm sure some of that was going on because it was going on here on the coast. But I don't think it was as widespread. Honestly, because even to this day, there's really nothing in that area. Versus down here on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, we had things here. We had a Keesler Air Force Base here, which is still here today. It's been operational since 1941. The Navy base in Gulfport. I'm not sure when the Navy base was open. I know it's been here as long as I've been alive. And of course, we have the beachfront. We have attractions. There's reasons to come to the coast. Even in the 1960s, versus why anybody would go to small town McNairy County, Tennessee, or Alcorn County, Mississippi, along the state line. Now, I've been up there. It's pretty country. But it doesn't have the attractions that we have down here. Therefore, I really don't think that it was as wide open as they're thinking, unless somebody was allowing it to happen. And that somebody was probably the sheriff. And who was the sheriff at the time that we're talking about? Buford Pusser. Buford Pusser. So was he a tyrant? Or was he corrupt? Was he permissive? Did he take the money and look the other way? What's the real story here? I would argue, and again, I'm basing this on just my knowledge of the area, knowledge of the era of the time. I would say that Buford Pusser, if there was a bunch of illegal joints going on the state line, I would argue that it's probably because he allowed it. Down here on the coast, once a month, the sheriff would write a disorderly conduct ticket for every slot machine in play. He'd make up phony names, he'd write them a disorderly conduct, and they would pay him every month. And he would put that money into his department and spread it amongst his deputies, taking a lion's share for himself. That's how we did it here on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. It was a tax without being a tax. You're going to do this, or you're not going to operate. If you do this, you will get the protection of my office. If you don't do this, you may get killed. And that's how it was ran down here for decades. I'm fairly certain that if that was going on in Tennessee, it was probably ran much the same way. Let's face it, even by today's standards, anybody who's a cop will tell you law enforcement doesn't pay much. Law enforcement is one of the lowest paid professions out there. Anybody who's worked for law enforcement, who's worked in corrections, we're going to tell you that. I've worked in corrections in a jail for $11.97 an hour as recently as the year 2021. I'm not saying that that's the rule, but it's certainly not unheard of. Also, keep in mind, sheriff's got a budget. In that budget, he's got to pay his people, equip his people, buy his cars, run his jail, feed his inmates. I mean, there's a lot to it. Investigate crimes. And if the county wants to raise taxes to pay for all that, they're going to get pushback. Nobody likes paying more taxes. So being that we're not paying more taxes, we got to figure out other ways of doing this. Was there corruption in the 60s? You better believe it. I know, again, here in Mississippi, there was a lot of it. In Tennessee, I'm fairly certain they followed the same suit. In the movie, Buford Pusser was billeted as a reformer. Was he really? What did he reform? If the state line gang still had illegal gambling operations going well into the 21st century, did he really reform anything? How about Louise Hathcock? W.O. Hathcock. Towhead White. Who were they? Well, if they were operating illegal gambling establishments on the state line, I believe they were on Highway 45. That would tell me that they were paying somebody to get the privilege to do it. My theory on Louise Hathcock and W.O. Hathcock is that Buford was probably sticking it to him and wanted more. And when they refused to cooperate, both of them wound up dead. Now, Towhead White, he did have the ties to the Dixie Mafia. Let me explain what the Dixie Mafia was. You have the Italian Mafia, the Irish Mafia, the Russian mob, Mexican Mafia, all these organized criminals. Usually, when in terms of those, they're on ethnic lines. Italians, mainly from Sicily. Mexican Mafia, obviously, they're mainly from Mexico. Irish Mafia, well, they're mainly from Ireland. Russian Mafia, well, they're mainly from Russia. There's ethnic ties. A lot of the so-called Dixie Mafia were Slavic immigrants, first and second generation Americans, that immigrated to Biloxi right around shortly before and shortly after the turn of the century. One of the main guys down here was a guy by the name of Mike Gillage, and he was in Biloxi. He ran several strip clubs, gambling houses, and whorehouses. And he was also basically the banker. I would say the silent partner, but he wasn't very silent. He knew how to get things done. One of the guys that was accused by Buford of killing his wife is a man by the name of Kirksey McCord Nix Jr. Kirksey Nix is from Oklahoma, the son of a state senator and judge. Whose dad befriended Mr. Mike, and when his son joined the Air Force in the 1960s, he came down to Biloxi. And Kirksey Nix he's still alive. He's a bad man. He's knocking on 80 years old now, but at 80 years old, I still wouldn't mess with that old man. He will spend, and he has been spending and will spend time the rest of his life in prison. He's been doing time since 1969. So of his 80 years of living, he spent better than 50 of them in prison. Angola, and in the federal system. Last I looked, he was at El Reno Federal Correctional Facility in Oklahoma. That's the last I looked anyway. Been a minute since I've looked. So Kirksey Nix, no question about it, he was a stone cold killer. No question in my mind. Undisputable, undeniable stone cold killer. I've dealt with many stone cold killers in my life. I haven't dealt with him personally. I've never worked the federal system. But I can know one when I see one. This is a guy that was accused of having a hand in killing a judge here in Mississippi from behind bars. And convicted of it, by the way. Which is how he got sent to the federal system. This is a man that, again, like I said, has no problem taking life. He's done it many, many, many times. But in 1967, apparently he tried to assassinate Buford Pusser, him and a few others. The movie shows two cars chasing Buford and his wife down a 2-lane back road in McNairy County, Tennessee, coming out from behind a church and opening fire with what looked like Browning automatic rifles or some other automatic 30 caliber weapons. Well, Mike Elam, author of Buford Pusser, the other story, states that only a couple of shell casings were found. He also states that even though you show Pauline Pusser as the loving wife, she was deathly afraid of her husband. Again, unfounded as far as I'm concerned, because I haven't found personally any corroborating evidence, but it's an interesting It's an interesting tale. And again, if it was true that Buford actually killed his wife in the 1960s, what are you going to do? Arrest the sheriff? That's not going to happen. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to arrest the sheriff back then. I'm not saying I believe everything that Mike Elam puts out. I'm not saying I believe everything that the Buford Pusser legend pushers put out. I'm simply saying that before you run your mouth about it, do some research and see what other people are saying and try to validate it. And that's what I intend to do. I want to validate it. I don't care if I'm wrong and Buford Pusser really was the Superman with no cape, or if he was as corrupt as I think he was. The trick is I want to validate it. I want to know. Another tidbit about the Dixie Mafia. Yes, they were ruthless. They were also very smart. Yes, they would kill you if you crossed them. There is bodies all over the place to prove that very fact. There's bodies all over this coast that have yet to be dug up. And I believe it. I know where a few of them are. I'll say no more on that just yet. They'll be dug up soon. They have no problem leaving a wake of destruction in their path. But they were also very smart. And they understood that sometimes it was better to pay off those in charge than to fight those in charge. Y'all think about it. This is part 1. Part 2, I'm going to delve into the psyche. Y'all have a good day. Thanks for watching History in the Eyes, or History with Anthony O. Wow, I changed the name of the channel, and I guess I had a brain for it. Call it a senior moment in my late 30s. Y'all have a good day.